So our goal as FAO is to achieve food security for all and make sure that people have regular access to enough food, both in quantity and quality. And this is very important, the concept of quality, to lead an active and healthy life. Despite the progress made after long-term decline in the numbers of undernourishment, we have seen in the last year since 2015 that the numbers of undernourishment have increased. Just to give you an idea, today we are in 690 million people undernourished, and between the previous year, 2018 and 2019, there was an increase in 10 million people moving into undernourishment, and in the last 5 years, 60 million people. In addition to that, globally, about 2 billion people are considered moderately or severely food insecure, and 2 billion people suffer from hidden hunger or micronutrient deficiencies, while progress in the reduction of stunting has slowed. Even in high-income countries, sizable proportions of the population lack regular access to nutritional sufficient food. Needless to say, COVID-19 has exacerbated this situation. So in our latest simulations, the increase in undernourishment because of COVID-19 could go between 83 to 132 million people coming into undernourishment, which is structural, in 2020. So this makes the target of achieving SDG 2 in 2030 very difficult to achieve, and that's where we are really concerned. And what FAO is trying to do is trying to identify how we can transform the food systems today so that we can achieve this goal, which is our major goal. And we understand that achieving that goal implies that we are going to create some trade-offs. We're going to create trade-offs in water, in soil, in energy, in biodiversity, and in emissions, and also in land inequality and in income inequality. So we need to identify them and try to minimize them and try to achieve them in the best possible way. So, for example, the last SOFI, the State of Food Insecurity and Nutrition in the World of FAO publication, has shown that one way to achieve this is to shift towards healthy diets. And the consumption of healthy diets, what will bring is that we will assure that people will be eating the quality of food that they are supposed to eat. But today, 30 billion people cannot access to healthy diets. They're too expensive, 5 times more expensive than energy-based diets. And what this means that we need to change the system of production, both in the supply and also in the demand side. In the supply side, we need to increase efficiencies, reduction of losses, reduction of waste on the consumer side, improvement of intra-regional trade, being more efficient in how we move commodities around the world. Also, we need to increase and correct the incentives. A lot of the incentives today are towards starchy crops and not to healthy diets. All of the subsidies in agriculture go to cereals. How we switch that, how we create the proper incentives. How we also, even in the emergency situations and through the safety mechanisms, the safety nets mechanisms, we provide healthy food rather than just cash to buy food without putting conditionalities. So there are many changes that we need to put in place, but we also know that the switch towards consumption of healthy diets, if we can make them affordable, will reduce non-communicable diseases in around 90%. So from $1.3 trillion a year until 2030 could be reduced in 90%. And in the case of emissions, this can be reduced between 30 to 75%. And there is $1.7 trillion a year in terms of the cost that these greenhouse gas emissions do today. So there are opportunities, there are possible changes, and FAO is trying to work on that, trying to work on reducing inequalities and to assure access to these healthy diets. But for that, we need to have policy programs and legal frameworks in place. We need to improve governance and coordination. We need to bring evidence-based decision-making, and we need to turn commitment into concrete action and investment. And FAO has lately launched a big program called Hand in Hand initiative, which is exactly trying to do this, but looking into the countries which are the most vulnerable, the least developed landlocked countries, the least developed countries, the food crisis countries, and large countries with significant concentrations of poverty. And we're using territorial approaches and latest technologies to be able to try to target and be more effective in the way we release constraints so that farmers can gain bigger profits so they can move out of poverty. Again, this is a huge food system transformation, but we need to do it now. We need to accelerate. If not, we are not going to achieve the 2030 goal. It's a huge task, but I don't think it's not feasible. I think that if we start aligning incentives and we start doing the proper targeting and effectiveness of policies, we can change things. And that at least will make us allow to, again, come back to the correct trend. No? Today, the trend on undernourishment is in the correct way. It's increasing. It should be decreasing. It could be that we don't achieve the 2030 goal. I hope we can, but if not, at least we should have the correct direction towards achieving the 2030 goal. So FAO analysis shows that most of the observed volatility in coffee prices can be attributed to coffee market specific shocks. So specifically, supply shocks dominate movements in coffee prices, so 70% of the total shocks, more so than any other factors, including precautionary inventory demand for coffee, fluctuations in macroeconomic variables, and energy prices. So this means that to build a sustainable coffee sector, reduce market volatility, and ensure sustainable livelihoods for coffee growers, especially for the poor ones, our attention is and should be placed on market fundamentals. It is important to bring about a permanently improved balance between supply and demand. On that basis, FAO is supporting the work of International Coffee Organization, the ICO, in the provision of accurate, reliable, and timely market information and analysis, in addition to advocating an increased and coordinated actions among the coffee producers, particularly in controlling output expansion. FAO also is looking at sustainable production strategies. It's also looking at the famous rust coffee, which is one of the major problems that face coffee in the last years, and which requires bringing new varieties, but also could require replanting. No? And for example, what we are saying today is that COVID-19 offers an opportunity. Why? Because clearly the demand will be reduced, and already we are observing reductions in demand of coffee today. Although during the COVID lockdowns, we saw an increase in demand of certain types of coffee, now the situation is starting to change, and we are going to reflect that, especially in the reduction of the demand because of the recession we're moving in. But coffee is grown in little trees, and you cannot reduce them. So you cannot change your planting. The planting is there. So you will have the same supply. It could be that you can reduce little yields because you use less inputs, but the supply will be the same. The advantage of coffee is that you can store up to a certain level. But on the other hand, you will have a significant lower demand. So it's a good time to rotate the trees and, for example, to rejuvenate the trees. And that's the options that they need to take advantage given the access of some financial support from the IFIs because of the crisis. So again, we need to find ways to gain opportunities. Coffee is a very interesting sector because you differentiate the product. You have different varieties, Arabica and non-Arabica, but even within the varieties, you have different price schemes. So market information, intelligence information on market prices is what will help to reduce our volatility in the markets. And that's very important in coffee. Coffee in the last months, before even and during the lockdown, show a significant volatility, an extreme level of volatility, because volatility is good, it gives liquidity. But what we found also was that it creates extreme values of volatility. And that's where it's not good, because that brings incentive for speculation. So we need to find ways to put more information on prices, more information on the markets, so that volatility can be calmed down. Because that's extreme values of volatility, that what we call excessive volatility, is what you want to avoid in the market of coffee. But then you also need to empower the value chains. You need to improve efficiency in the value chains. You need to improve product quality. And for that, you need to keep high standards of production and trees that are rejuvenated over the years. And a lot of the coffee also happens in pretty poor countries, in Honduras, in Central America, and so on. And the harvest is done in the hills. No, it's very difficult to harvest coffee. So again, we need to find ways to formalize more the market and to start putting more clear standards that will allow us to improve efficiency of coffee. So again, FAO is working on all these dimensions. FAO is working not only on the disease, on the rust coffee, it's also working in how to bring capacities, how to increase efficiencies of the value chain, and how to make the coffee production more sustainable. So the first thing that I think is important to mention is that agriculture has shown to be very resilient. Agricultural workers continue to work, and we need to have food. Today, we don't have a problem of food availability. Food is available, despite of all the logistical problems that we observe, especially in cereals. There were logistical problems, but mostly in high-value commodities, like in coffee, because of the labor force. No, coffee is harvested by migrant laborers, and those were facing problems because of the lockdowns. So despite all those logistical problems, what we have observed is that the sector keeps moving and keeps trying to resolve those problems. And many of the private sector companies and the public are trying to find ways in which we declare the food a priority sector, so that the food value chains continue to be alive. Now, What will happen in the future is very complicated because we are facing a recession, and what that means lower demand, and that means lower prices, and we already were in lower prices. So it will face another challenge for farmers, not only the challenge that they have to face because of climate change and the weather shocks and the extreme situations they are facing today, not only the pests like what we are seeing in Africa because of the locust invasion, or what we are seeing in banana because of TR4, or what we are seeing in maize because of armyworm, but they are also now going to face a recession, and we need to be realistic with that. And the only thing we can do is try to find opportunities. And which are for me the opportunities is finding mechanisms in which we will help farmers to be able to cope with the risk of the shocks. And one way to do that is basically to have capacity of storage. And that's where coffee has an advantage. But you need to have the proper storage facilities. But because why? Because you need to give farmers the capacity to store their commodity for at least 12 months to 18 months until the recession moves out, so that they can then sell to a better market, if they have the capacity to resist. You also need to provide liquidity to farmers right now. Farmers are facing significant liquidity constraints, and if we want them to be able to plan for the next season, they need to have some liquidity release. And one way to do that is, for example, to work with the central banks to create guarantees. And for the smallholders, the guarantees have to be 100%. For large farmers, it can be lower, 25%. That's what they need because they already have credit history in the financial system. But the small farmers are informal, they don't have that. And that's the way I think we can create that. And we know farmers pay back. And guarantees conditional on delivering the products to the local market if they don't have an international market, if this is export-oriented products, or to deliver them to food banks. But at least they will have liquidity with a period of grace of 12 months that will allow them to plan for the next season and at least cope with this recession that we are facing. So the situation is not easy. It's a very, very complex situation today. And we need to find ways to help. What will be wrong, for example, is to start with problems of trade restrictions and trade constraints, which at the beginning of the COVID-19, we start to face that. Thanks God now, there are only 2 countries with some export restrictions, but the effect over overall exports is close to 0. This is not the moment to do this, because food is available and we cannot create a condition that will end in a food crisis. There is no need to bring a food crisis. Our problem right now is a problem of access to food. People having money to be able to procure food, to be able to buy the food that they need. And that's an income issue. And that's what we need to be focusing. So again, I think we need to be realistic of what we are going to face. We need to find ways and alternative markets, and one way to do that is trade, intra-regional and international trade. But we also need to find ways in which we can provide liquidity so that they can do planting for the next season. But specifically in the case of coffee, the liquidity will be important, but also taking advantage to do the investment you need so that you improve your yields in the next season after we pass this recession. That's a pretty complex question. First of all, I think it's important to understand that what climate change brings and what I believe climate change brings to farmers, or what is the major problem it brings to farmers, is not necessarily levels of high temperatures or low temperatures. I think the major problem they face is volatility. So the variability that they're going to face in temperatures because of extreme temperatures and huge variability of weather over the night, that's what will bring a lot of uncertainty to farmers. And if you have uncertainty, it's very difficult to make optimal decisions of the use of inputs and the planting. And that's something, although farming sector is used to weather volatility, the more extreme the situation, the more the climate change, the more the variability of that, and that will make them have to make them decisions under uncertainty, which is pretty complex. Now, despite that, I think there are ways in which we can cope with those risks. And if we look at today and we look at our projections to 2030, the world food market will be able to supply the food that is needed. What we are seeing is a significant increase in productivity in the staple world, increases in productivity in the high-value commodity, although we have a problem of food safety issues. And in the case of the livestock and the meat sector, what we will see is increasing productivity, but also expansion in areas, in number. So just the increase in productivity won't cover the demand that we will need in the future. So I don't see that we are not going to be able to deliver the food that we need tomorrow. Now, is this going to be sustainable or not? And that's where we need to understand carefully what are the trade-offs. So if my objective function is to feed the world with healthy diets, I need to understand that there are trade-offs that will affect soil, water, energy, emissions, biodiversity, within others, and will also affect land distribution and income distribution. But especially in the first 5, I need to understand them, and I need to see what policy I can put in place to compensate them. So if I look at the world today, and I look at the level of greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and the level of consumption, for example, the US is over-emitting to what they really need. Uganda, on the other side, is under-emitting to what they really need. So there will be some countries that they will need to emit more by producing more meat, for example, and others that need to reduce their meat consumption because they're already eating too much meat and therefore creating more emissions. And that's the balancing act that we need to bring together. But the other concept that we need to bring in place is that climate change is a global problem. It's not a private problem. So if I produce more products and that will create more emissions, but that will allow me to give healthy diets affordable to an individual, I don't need to increase the cost of that diet to the individual to resolve a problem at the global level. At the global level, we need to compensate. And that's where we need to start to align incentives. What I mean, New Zealand today is trying to reduce the amount of cattle they produce to comply to their commitments to the COP23. New Zealand produces cattle in the most efficient way ever in terms of emissions. So the level of emissions at a cow in New Zealand is significantly lower than the level of emissions of a cow in Nairobi in Kenya. Now, but that country is reducing. So if that country reduces the production, the Nairobi or the Kenya producer will increase their cattle production, which I know is inefficient in terms of emissions. That doesn't make any sense. What I want is New Zealand to keep producing and to produce more because they have the technology to do it efficiently, or at least to invest in the Kenyan one so that they improve the way they produce. So again, this comes up to the concept of trading of emissions. So we need to find ways in which we can trade emissions so that we can equalize this world, so that we can produce what we need to produce and not transfer a public good issue to an individual, which is a private consumer. The emissions is a public good issue that affects the whole world. I cannot ask my consumer to just eat sustainable, healthy diets, because sustainable, healthy diets is very complex. It's not only healthy diets that today are affordable, it's adding to that the sustainability concept. Why the individual will have to cover that cost when that sustainability concept is a global concept? So again, we need to think carefully the incentives, and that's why having a food system approach is central, because that's what will allow us to understand the trade-offs and to see which policies. It could be that there are policies at the global level, like soil management, soil transformation, forestry, many other policies that could compensate the emissions we need to have in place to be able to achieve the goal of the demand. And of course, we need to have in place regulations. We don't want the deforestation of our forests and so on and so forth. But in our simulations today, we can achieve the food needs without having to have expansion. It's more on gains on productivity. But of course, some countries could choose to expand. And that's where we need to bring more institutionality and more regulatory mechanisms in place. We also need to bring digital technologies and innovations to be able to find ways in which we can be more efficient in the way we produce. And there are huge efficiencies we can gain, and one of those is reduction of losses. We know today that there is around 14.6% of losses, not of waste, losses. And those are mostly in high-value commodities. Now, if we look at the whole literature of what has been done to be able to minimize those losses, especially in the staple commodities, has been storage, and most of them has failed. So how we can innovate so that we can really reduce losses? And then, of course, there is the component of waste, which we can reduce. And there is a lot of space there also to reduce emissions. Remember, if we look at the food loss and waste, where I am minimizing emissions which are already incurred, is on the consumer side, at the end of the value chain. Because that's where I already have incurred not only the production emissions, but also the transportation emissions and so on and so forth. So everything I waste at the level of the consumer is already wasting more potential reduction of emissions. While in terms of soils and water is at the level of the producer. That's where reduction on losses will benefit the environment. So we need to be smart. We need to find ways to solve those problems, and I think we can do it. It's just an issue of starting to act and to behave properly. Yes. So look, FAO major goal is SDG 2 and of course SDG 1, which is the poverty goal. Why? Because almost 80% of the world poor are in rural areas, and most of the activities, economic activities in rural areas, are linked to food and agriculture. And food is broader than just agriculture. No? So we play a crucial role here, and we need to find ways in which we can improve access to markets, and that's where infrastructure plays a crucial role. We need to find ways in which we can increase efficiency and transparency of information. That's where ICT technologies play a crucial role. And for example, FAO has just approved the development of the International Platform for Digital Food and Agriculture, which their role is to try to bring state-of-the-art technologies and best practices in the world to all developing countries, with partners to facilitate and leapfrog over the technologies that are available. So all of the things we do are oriented towards development and towards rural development. And we don't see it as a discrete, we see it as a continuum between urban and rural areas, because a lot of the processing of the food, the packaging, and the food processing happens in peri-urban, urban areas because it's where the energy is. If you go at the packaging plants, they are in the urban areas. Even in coffee, you go to the peeling, you will see that they are in urban areas in Ethiopia, for example. So again, you cannot see just rural and forget the urban. There is a continuum because of access to energy. And so we look at all that in that dimension. We look at the whole value chain. We don't look just at the producer side. Of course, we look at producers, we look how to improve efficiency and how to improve their profits. And when I refer to profits, it's because I look at supply and demand. It doesn't make any sense for me to go to a plot or to a village and to increase productivity with new varieties if those increasing yields won't have a market. So that's why I'm referred to profits. I need to create the market also, to find the demand for these producers to sell. And that could imply institutional reform in terms of concentration of production, which does not mean land reform. It means that I need to find ways to create a scale with the smallholder production that I have. And there is very innovative ways of doing this, like the corporate farming that is happening in Vietnam, for example, where every farmer puts their plot as part of a corporation, and where the corporation basically brings technical assistance. The same is happening now in Africa with the Ethiopian Transformation Agency and the agro parks. They're trying to create these agribusinesses with the smallholders involved, where the land is given as a concession, as a share, and they have the right to work or not, or to just get a rent from sharing their land. So we have to innovate, because we need to create a scale to be able to have food standards, to be able to have food safety, and to be able to access better markets. What we don't want is a farmer to do the efforts to produce, for example, aflatoxin-safe maize, but when he arrives to the market doesn't pay him the price difference, because the market doesn't recognize that standard. What we want is, if we help a farmer to invest into having an aflatoxin-safe maize, that when he goes to the market, he gets a premium for doing that investment. That's what will create sustainable development, and we'll be able to move these people out of poverty. In our approach, in our hand-in-hand approach in FAO, we are trying to create that. We're trying to identify over the space in the country's areas where farmers will have a significant capacity to improve. And if they improve, they will be automatically moved out of poverty line. So we measure what will be their potential profits producing what they have, meaning supply and demand, and seeing where they are today. And we find that there are many areas where there is a lot of inefficiencies. And then we do zooms into those areas, and we work with the stakeholders to identify what are the bottlenecks, why they are not achieving what other farmers in the same location under the same conditions can achieve. But we know that if we make them achieve their maximum potential, they will get more than the extreme poverty line. They will be moving out of poverty, $7 PPP a day, which is where we want to move them out sustainable of poverty. And for that, we also need to work with the private sector. We need to attract the private sector and to attract them to make proper investments to resolve these bottlenecks. Access to finance is central. Access to advisory services is central. And we need to find ways in which we can promote also climate smart agriculture when it's profitable. So it's not like something that always will be profitable. In many cases, climate smart agriculture is not profitable. But we need to find ways to do that, and we need to be inclusive, and we need to minimize the differences that exist between woman and male. We know, for example, that in many cases the female work in the plot, but they don't own the plot. The plot is under the name of the male. So when the commodity is sold, the money goes to the male, and that doesn't distribute to the household. Even in the Maasai, for example, the Maasai in Tanzania, they handle the cattle, the male, and the woman wants the milk, but the male wants to sell the meat. So they don't feed the cattle so that they produce more milk, which is what will give more returns to the female. So again, all these differences need to be resolved, but that's our job. Our job is to try to find ways in which we can move people out of poverty, and in which we can, through a food system approach, trying to make them move into a better situation that will allow them to sustainable move out of poverty. Yeah, the 2030 agenda is not an FAO agenda, of course, it's the SDGs agenda. FAO is custodian of many SDGs indicators, especially indicators around SDG 2, but also SDG 3 on health, SDG 4 on education, SDG 5 on gender equality, and SDG 6 on water, and SDG 8 on economic growth. We also play a role in infrastructure, SDG 9, and inequality, which is central here, SDG 10, because inequality is huge in rural areas. And of course in SDG 14 and 16 and 15. So we play a role in many SDGs. But our job right now is to find ways in which we can transform the food systems so that we are able to achieve mainly SDG 2 and 1, but taking into consideration the other SDGs. For example, the SDG in water is essential for FAO. Why? Because food brings water. Food has water. And we move food with water, but we don't price that water. So virtual trade of water is something that we are looking at to try to minimize those roles. We also look a lot at inequality. We believe that the only way we can do that is reducing inequality, and infrastructure plays a crucial role of that, and that brings SDG 9. So many of these dimensions play a role together. But again, our core objective function is SDG 2, and achieving that requires all the other SDGs to operate. We normally look at SDGs as silos, and that's a big mistake. In FAO, we are thinking differently now. We are looking at it as a system, and all the SDGs plays a role. There is no way we will achieve sustainable people moving out of poverty if we don't reduce inequality in the world. And that's what we will have to do, especially in rural areas. No, indeed, you are completely right. The pests and diseases are among the main factors affecting agricultural production today, both in animal and plant sectors. It estimates more or less that around 20 to 40% of plant production is lost due to pests and diseases, and this is completely linked to climate. Transborder pests and diseases can have a significant impact on food security and trade. So we have to do a lot of things around this. For example, right now in locust, we were able to alert the world that there was a big problem of locusts coming. We were not able initially to get the resources to stop very early to avoid this to happen. We were able to raise some resources later, but we are trying to fight against locusts right now in Africa, in Eastern Africa, and trying to avoid it moving to West Africa. But it's a difficult task, and sometimes the response is not immediate, and we don't have the resources. But what we have learned from all this is that we need to have early warning tools in place, and we need to have the most sophisticated early warning tools in place so that we can alert the system as soon as possible to minimize the potential consequences of what this will imply. So the only way to be more resilient is to be more resilient to these situations, because these situations are going to happen. It's unavoidable. The climate will change, temperatures will go to extremes, and that will create these problems that we are facing today. But the more capable we are to have some predictive power, of course it will never be perfect, and to have early warning systems in place, I think the better it will be and the more resilient we will become. But at the same time, we need to bring intelligence and trying to see which are the crops that farmers can opt to be able to cope better with the situation they are facing. One good historical example is the case of potatoes. As you know, in the Andean, especially in Peru, there are 3,000 varieties of potatoes. And the farmers, the traditional farmers from the Inca Empire, used to experiment. And they used to experiment at different levels, different heights, and at different agroecological zones, different temperatures and microclimates. And that allowed them to have the diversity of varieties that they can use given the different situations. That type of capacity we need to again build up. We need to allow farmers to have that options. This is a world that is moving to a world of uncertainty, and we need to make decisions under uncertainty. And the best way we can protect our farm sector is to provide them options that will allow them to have the varieties that will work under certain conditions that they will be facing. And that requires research and development, requires innovation, and that's where the CIR can play a crucial role. But we need to bring enormous investment in research and development and innovation so that we are prepared. So it's not just an issue of today. Today we can do something, but it's also an issue of planning for tomorrow. And if we don't plan better for tomorrow, we won't be able to cope with all these risks. And that applies completely to coffee also, because coffee is very vulnerable, and we need to be prepared for that. Yes, the International Center of Potatoes is the one that has the gene bank on potato varieties. And they are doing trying to replicate the historical experiments. And if you go to Cusco, you will see that there are valleys that are looking into all these different varieties and the different climatological zones. We need to understand that agriculture is not a competitive sector. Agriculture is composed of big players and many, many small players, but most of the production is handled by big players. If not the production, the trade is even worse. It's highly concentrated. Also, if we move to the input markets, it's extremely concentrated. Fertilizer industry, 4 or 5 countries control all the fertilizer industry because of natural resources. It's a very concentrated market in all the dimensions of inputs, production, and trade and mobility. But on the other hand, having global regulatory institutions doesn't work. We know that. What works is information. What works is sharing information. What works is promoting competition. Like, for example, in the fertilizer industry, Africa is the continent that has the least use of fertilizers, not because it's too expensive. So for years, we were talking about building the plant of fertilizer in Nigeria because Nigeria has the natural resources, and that will open competition. There will bring one more player to the world, and that reduce the price of fertilizers to a level that will allow Africa to increase consumption and use of fertilizers. And of course, as a consequence, to increase yields and to increase their wealth. So finally, this was tried to push through several G20s, but finally, the IFC of the World Bank was able to do the investment and bring up the private sector companies and the blending necessary to set up the plant of fertilizers in Nigeria. So Nigeria has one of the biggest plants of fertilizer production that could supply fertilizers to all Africa. The capacity of that plant can supply to all Africa. But when you go and ask the plant, where do you sell? 80% goes to Latin America. And why? Because it's too costly to move fertilizers across borders in Africa. So the solution that we thought was the solution to create a new player was not the solution at the end of the line. The solution is to promote more trade intra-regional and to improve the infrastructure of transportation so that fertilizer can move at a cheaper rate. So again, this brings to the concept of complements. No? We need to complement policies. It's not just one thing. So I don't see the solution is to create antitrust and global anti-competitive measure. No. But regionally, yes. Like Europe has a good regional antitrust mechanism. Africa could have a regional antitrust mechanism, and that's the role of the African Union. They need to empower that. But at the country level, it will be too complex because it will be too complex to have the capacities and the skills to do these regulatory mechanisms, because companies will be able to afford better stuff, and therefore they will always win you in terms of these cases. But at the regional level, yes, we can replicate what happened in Europe. And that could help to increase and improve competition. But again, we need to think also how to increase and reduce market concentration, and also how to find ways in which vertical integration doesn't enforce market power. So for example, if I have a very concentrated financial system and I link that power to production in agriculture through agribusinesses, then I am transferring the power of the financial system to the value chain. And we need to find ways to avoid that. So, and there is laws on mergers and acquisitions and so on and so forth that protect you for doing that. That's what happens in the banking system and so on and so forth. But that has to be at the regional level. That's the way I see. But market power, but on the other hand, having concentration doesn't mean that you have market power. No? It depends, and that's what you need to assess carefully. So this world of industrial organization into agriculture is really important, because we need to figure out how to understand better how agriculture, which is a business at the end of the line, full of micro entrepreneurs and micro enterprises, which are these little farmers, but also with some corporate farmers, how they interrelate to each other and how we can facilitate that mechanism. And that's where reducing inefficiencies will help. That's where information and ICT technology, digital technologies will help. Where we are seeing in COVID-19, for example, is that e-commerce could be an option to reduce transaction costs, to give better information to farmers so that the margins are not obtained only by the intermediaries, which play a role. I am not saying the intermediaries are wrong or are bad. They play a role. But if we are able to find better ways to reduce that value chain and the distance, then it could be that their role is gone and the farmers can get more earnings as a result of that. So we need to find all these ways that will increase competition, will increase access to market, and will also allow for more product differentiation. In agriculture, we need to increase product differentiation. That's what will give more revenue to farmers. And in high-value commodities, we do it, but mostly for export commodities, but not for local markets. And I see that's where the innovation can go, so that we can have better qualities, differentiate products, and consumers will choose what they buy, depending on their income, of course, but also depending on their own taste and behavior. So I think that's the way we need to take this, and that's the way we need to analyze at the current market structure. But for sure, agriculture is not a competitive market. Look, FAO position is that science and technology, including agricultural biotechnology, can play a significant role in the fight against food insecurity and malnutrition. That's clear for us. So regarding GMOs and genetic modification, which is used to produce genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, FAO thinks that GMOs can help in some circumstances to increase production and productivity and thus contribute to food security and nutrition. However, it is important to be aware of the concerns that GMOs could potentially pose risk for humans and animal health and environment. So the most important thing for us is to be evidence-based, and every country has to have their evidence and make their own choices based on that evidence. Our job is to provide the evidence, and then the country will make their own decision of what they want to do. So this has to be looked at case-by-case basis and look at the potential benefits, the risk associated with the application of GMOs, and also with gene editing, which is in the case of the EU is considered also as a GMO. So we support member nations to strengthen their institutional capacity and human capacity so that they could keep with the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety and use GMOs safely. That's the important thing. So how is the ultimately decision of the country on using or not using GMOs or any biotechnology is something that the member nations will take. We just contribute by providing evidence and capacities. And again, the more evidence-based are these decisions, the better it will be. Because if not, we could be losing opportunities that could be important to reducing hunger and to be more resilient to weather shocks and to climate shocks that we will be facing. But again, it's a decision of the countries to do that. Yeah, the SOFI of 2018 focused on conflict and climate shocks. And what we found is that countries that were facing conflict were countries that had significant higher levels of undernourishment, which is a chronic problem. And of course, of acute hunger, which is more a temporal concept of hunger. So conflict, and we see it today in most of the 55 food crisis countries that we have today, in many of them is because of conflict. The ones that are doing the worst are because of conflict. So conflict reduces opportunities, reduces access to market, reduces capacity of people to work in their land. They will be moved out of their lands. And that's all the things that you don't want to happen. So what we can do, if you are moved out of your capacities to do your work, the only thing we can do is bring safety protection, social protection. So FAO has a significant program for emergencies on social protection policies that can play a role of prevention and can respond very quickly. We work together with the World Food Program on this so that we can at least provide the requirements, the minimum requirements that these people that are affected by conflict can get to be able to continue their subsistence and to be able to avoid them moving into a phase 5, IPC phase 5, that will be basically detrimental of their lives. it affects labor force, it affects their sources of income, and we need to avoid that. What we are trying to do nowadays with the Hand in Hand, for example, initiative, is trying to work in areas which are not in conflict, but which are in close distance to areas in conflict, trying to empower the value chains in those areas so at least we can attract labor force from conflict zones. That we believe could increase also the resilience of the people that are living in conflict zones, especially when the conflict disappears. Because the problem is, once the conflict is over, people don't have any assets to keep doing things. And it will take them years to be able to recover their livelihoods, to be able to start to produce again. And that's where we believe creating these extended value chains could help them to increase their resilience and at least to keep some of their livelihoods so that they can resolve the situation they are facing today. So we provide data and analysis related to food security and nutrition in conflict zones. We develop local contextual analysis to understand the root causes and drivers of conflict and try to work on trying to create rural development to minimize that in the future. We support early warning and information systems linked to decision making and actions, such as the early warning, early action system that we have in place. We promote equitable access to natural resources, which are often cited as one of the main drivers of conflict, by strengthening the efficiency of conflict management and mechanisms to address these disputes. We create incentives for collaboration between and within communities to contribute to social cohesion. For example, the Dimitra clubs to promote social mobilization and participation of rural people in economic and political and social life of their community. We partner with civil society organizations, farmer organizations, and cooperatives. We directly provide livelihood assistance to farmers, pastoralists, fish folks, and forest-dependent communities, and interlink agricultural assistance. We have a whole program of cash system transfers, a program of delivery of e-vouchers of extension for emergencies, and we have a whole unit of FAO linked to resolve the problem of emergencies. And conflict is one of the core issues that we're trying to resolve. But we do it in partnership with our major UN partners. Yeah. Our most recent initiative, what I mentioned before, is the Hand in Hand initiative. So the Hand in Hand initiative look at least developed landlocked countries, least developed small islands, and food crisis countries and countries which are large, like Bangladesh or Nigeria, that have enormous hotspots of poverty. So we are exactly targeting those countries. And what we are doing is we're using state-of-the-art technology and we're using territorial approaches to target interventions and policies that will help to reduce the inefficiencies on the production that farmers face today. And we customize interventions. So we are not using one intervention for the whole country. On the contrary, we are going into the space of each country and target policies and interventions in each of the different areas. And then we have a mechanism of matchmaking in which we bring donors to match those needs, because we design investment plans and we do roundtables to identify what are the priority bottlenecks. We prioritize them, and then the investment plans are designed to resolve those bottlenecks. The Hand in Hand initiative right now is covering around 55 countries, which are most of these countries that you are referring to. It's an initiative that will go for 8 years. And it has clear indicators. It has an M&E system in place with clear monitoring and impact indicators. And it works in partnership with the private sector, with civil society, and NGOs and universities. Why? Because we want to bring best practices, but we also want to attract private investors where the private sector can do something. So we're working with a series of companies to try to bring solutions. For example, working with MasterCard to try to bring financial solutions, working with Syngenta on technology, with Mars on production techniques and identifying aflatoxins. So the whole thing that we're trying to do is to find ways to increase efficiency of interventions. We are also developing a GIS platform, which we launched today. It's called the Hand in Hand Geospatial Platform, Hand in Hand Geospatial Platform, launched today, which brings 20 units of generation of data of FAO across the different water, soils, land, productivity, yields, socioeconomic variables, pests and diseases, together with data of our partners, so that we can improve the way we target and do our geographical and territorial approaches. We are also developing a system of information of what donors are doing over the space. So I don't only want to know, like for example in Haiti, that there are 20 donors, but I also want to know which projects they are doing, so that if we find a problem, we identify if somebody else is working on it and fix it if it is not working well, or if not, we identify the gap and we bring an investment plan to resolve that problem. So it's a very targeted approach, very tight in time, but the goal is not to let anyone behind and to especially target interventions in this country through multi-sectoral policies. And not only doing interventions, but also bringing in the policy environment. We have a program called MAFAP, which exactly tries to bring policy designs to create proper incentives. And also we have the FAPTA, which is tracking all the policies being implemented in the countries so that we know what they are doing, and we bring to the governments what are the benefits and the problems of those policies, and what are potential solutions to improve them and potential best practices to improve them. So it's a very comprehensive approach, which started 6 months ago, and we hope in the first cutting point, which is 4 years from now, we will be able to show impacts. But at the end of the 8 years, we are supposed to at least change the trend of hunger and poverty in the correct direction, at least. We don't think we will be able to achieve the SDG goals, but at least we will be able to correct the trend so that we are in the correct direction of reducing poverty and reduction of hunger. First of all, let me clarify that the purpose of the establishment of the FAO China South-South Cooperation Program is to support countries in Global South to attain SDGs, not to realize the Chinese National Development Goals. That has to be very clear. It's very clear. So we are trying to bring best practices South-South and North-South interlink, but not to realize the China's National Development Goals. So the South-South cooperation is a complement to North-South cooperation, supporting developing countries in exchanging its best practices, technologies, expertise, and policies for the mutual benefit within the cross regions, aiming to support the development of the Global South through mutual collaboration. For example, in the Hand in Hand initiative I mentioned, many countries that are supporting the initiative as donors are South countries from the South. They are bringing not money, but they are bringing technologies, innovations. For example, Argentina is doing that, helping African countries, Brazil. And that is helping enormously the process of bringing best practices. So the South-South offers a wide range of development solutions, knowledge, experience, good practices, innovative policies, technology, know-how, and resources that are cost-effective. That's how FAO looks at it. So for FAO, the South-South Cooperation Program is guided by 3 core principles: inspiration, inclusion, and innovation. And we want to inspire other countries to do the same thing and to support bringing their best practices. For example, Peru had enormous best practices in elimination of malnutrition in the country. They were very successful in doing that, in elimination of stunting. And many other countries have other best practices to share. We want to improve food security promotion, and we want to resolve problems that are faced by these countries. So the SDG attainment in SDG 1, SDG 2 on hunger, SDG 17 on partnerships, is the core behind the 2030 agenda. And that's what we want to touch with this South-South cooperation. So again, I think it's a way to learn from others and to improve and to leapfrog. And the goal is not to leave anyone behind, and that's what we are aiming to do in the Hand in Hand initiative, in our South-South cooperation program, and in the way we are working with all our members to achieve SDG 2 and SDG 1. We can learn from each other as much as we can. And if that helps to resolve the problems, let it go, let it happen. Yes, we can feed the estimated 9 billion people today. If we look at our projections, in the case of staple commodities and high-value commodities, mostly through productivity gains, not even for expansion of land. If we go to look at the meat sector, it is because of productivity gains, but also expansion of land. That does not mean that we're going to do it in a sustainable way. And that's the challenge. The challenge is how we feed this population, giving them access to healthy diets, not only to energy-based diets, but at the same time assuring that we don't push our limits of our environment. And that's where we need to find ways to minimize those trade-offs, because achieving that goal of feeding these people with healthy diets is going to push some of the boundaries. So how we minimize those trade-offs? As I mentioned, just switching from energy-based diets to healthy diets will benefit the reduction of emissions in between 35 to 75%. Will benefit the reduction of health costs in 90-95%. So we're talking of $1.7 trillion per year until 2030, $1.3 trillion per year of 2030 that we can save. But there are other trade-offs in water, in soils, and so on. Reduction of food losses will help substantially at the producer level. That's why I say losses, to reduce those trade-offs on water, on soils, on energy. And reduction of waste will help also improving the environment. But what we need to be clear is to differentiate what is a private good to what is a public good. That's the only way we're going to achieve this goal. And for that, trade is central. Because a public good is at the global level, and we cannot make the poorest consumers to afford the cost of what is happening in the environment today. We need to find a way to share, and we need to find a way to work together, and that's why multinational cooperation, multilateral cooperation is central. We need to reactivate what was established in Kyoto but didn't work, the trade of emissions. That needs to be reactivated. We need to find ways to create that. There are new alternatives right now happening. Costa Rica and Spain are trying to promote new ways, but we need to accelerate again this idea of trading emissions. That's the only way we're going to achieve feeding these 9 billion people and doing it in a sustainable way. I think food is evolving substantially. What COVID-19 has done has accelerated many things in the food industry, which still are not so evident, but they will be soon. Like, for example, if you look at the world and what types of food moves around the world, the biggest movers are staples, followed by fruits and vegetables, followed by fruits and by meats. Vegetables move very short distances. What is going to happen in the future is that vegetables will start to be produced closer to the urban areas. Why? Because controlled environments are cost effective today. So horizontal farming is going to accelerate, and it's accelerating a lot. The other thing that will be happening very soon is automatization, and we are observing that already in the European countries. Because of COVID-19, the acceleration to automatization, especially in the packaging industry, in the processing industry, has moved substantially. Automatization in the production side will start to accelerate. It's already started, even in Africa, in Rwanda, for example, in South America, in Argentina, because they have understand that we need to have physical distance, and that's make it difficult. So automatization will happen. What is the challenge of this automatization and the acceleration that we're facing? The challenge is that the labor force is not ready for that. This is moving 10 years early to what it was supposed to be. So now we need to accelerate building capacities. We need to accelerate ways we train the youth in Africa, in Asia, that we need to move them into the rural areas, but in a different type of job, in a job to provide services to this automatization. So that needs to happen very quickly. Education needs to accelerate, and technical capacities need to accelerate, because we are moving into a digital world. We're moving into an agriculture which will be digital. That's why our initiative of the International Platform of Digital Food and Agriculture plays a crucial role. And that's why we call it digital food, because it's not just digitalization, which is basically access and cables. It's more than that. It's the whole environment. To be able to have e-commerce, you need to have the platform. You need to have the availability of food, of course, to be able to trade in the platform, but you need to have the transportation also to be able to mail the food. And you need to have the capabilities to be able to develop and use these technologies. You need to have e-money, mobile money. You need to have the regulation for mobile money. So all those elements is what we call digital food. But that's where we are moving. We're moving to a world of e-commerce. We're moving to a world of shorter distances. We are moving to a world that vegetables will be grown closer. Fruits and staples will continue to move long distances, because the productivity is so high in the staple world that doesn't make any sense for smaller countries to produce that. Fruits are trees, and the climate varies and the seasons vary, and if you want to have supplies of fruits across the year, that's the only way it will happen. So that will continue. But we need to learn, and COVID-19 has accelerated many things silently, but they are accelerating, and that's where I see the future of food in the next years.